操 hello 啊，外网的亲朋好友们。Today we're going to be making orejas de cerdo, Schweineohren, palmiers. You also call them elephant's ears in English, or as I like to call them, butterfly cookies. They have many names across many different places all across the world, and today we're going to teach you why it is one of the simplest, easiest, and most worth your time little treats to make it home. We're going to talk about some of the history. We're going to talk about some of the influence, and talk about why this is situationally a Chinese classic, despite being 0% Chinese. So, without further ado, let's walk you through some of the basic steps. It's technically just 2 ingredients, puff pastry and sugar. Beyond that, just some time and patience. What you do is slice it in half and superimpose one on top of the other. You roll it out a little bit with a layer of sugar in betwixt both. No, you can't use diet sugar. No, you can't use no sugar. No, you can't even use less sugar. Because who wants to have a diet version of a butter cookie? When this goes for a bake, the sugar that you've used, the massive amount of sugar that you've used, will turn your layer of diabetes into a thick, crunchy caramel shell around your cookie. Use sugar as your dusting flour in this recipe. Sheet of puff pastry, sugar on the bottom, sugar on top, sugar all around, and then roll it out. Roll it out thin, and you want to either trifold it, like a book, or you can slice it into thirds and then superimpose that once again and roll it out thin, at which point you want to cut into half and reserve in the freezer to make it go stiff, because after all of this rolling, it's probably softened up quite a bit. Because if it's too soft, the butter will melt and fly the out. The amount of superimposing and stacking that you do will affect the general flakiness in the end. If you are French, or German, or Spanish, or Algerian, you might want it to be crunchy, in which case you can superimpose them less. Just roll it out thin and fold it in half and roll it out once more. If you want it to be more loose flaky, superimpose more time. Having grown up with a Shanghainese mum, butterfly biscuits, or 蝴蝶酥, are very light flaky. All right answers. It's entirely up to you. All right, after all those steps, you will end up with something that looks like this. Pretty much looks like how it looked like when you started, except now, it's got a bunch of little divots in it. It almost looks like it has terrible skin. And from here, you have the choice of rolling it out as thin as you wish before you go to shape it into cookies. Now, a little bit about the history of this dish and why it's Chinese ? This is a pastry that is quintessentially French, but born of colony. It's called a palmier. I like the story that this was originally made in Algeria, French Algeria, and it was named after the palm trees. Pretty much every European had their own version of this beloved treat, which is why it perfectly had the bedrock to become popular in Shanghai. This is all according to my grandpa. When he was born in 1934, it was the height of the former French concession. It was when the bourgeoisie, the literati, the affluent Chinese, as well as the European businessmen and nobility would cruise around the streets of Shanghai and live their best lives. During this time, there were a few important companies. One of them was called Butterfield and Swire. Its Chinese name was Taigu Yanghao. It is the exact same company as the Taigu sugar refinery, which is what makes our sugar even to this day. So Butterfield and Swire was originally a trades and commerce company that operated deeply in Shanghai. Most of their income came from trading, commerce. They also have sugar refinery, and they were one of the founding members of Khitan Airways, or as you would call it, Cathay Pacific Airlines. They were the most important of the whites. What they liked, or rather what their wives liked, is what led the way of fashion and lifestyle back in the day. To sit at a cafe and have a coffee with a biscuit or a dessert is a very European and fancy activity, which is why to this day a lot of old Shanghainese people don't call the time in the afternoon tea time, they call it coffee time. There were, at this time during my grandpa's childhood, a lot of bakeries and restaurants that served exactly this, 蝴蝶酥, as they would be called. Most famous of which was a restaurant called 德大西菜社, which is still operational today. These bakeries were largely on a street called Avenue Joffre, or as we call it today, 淮海路. Avenue Charcot was the main street, the main high street in the former French concession. And on this high street were the fancy pastry places. There was Cafe Vienna via the Austrians and the German businessmen in Shanghai. There was Cafe Caldi, which was frequented by the English. There was Mavros & Co., which was opened by a Greek immigrant. Of these bakeries, my grandpa said that his dad's favorite was one called Paul and Bartley on Huaihailu. When the streets were filled with horse-drawn carriages and European businessmen, my grandpa would start every morning with xiaolongbao, and then every weekend, if he was good at school, and he actually went to school, which is a huge deal, his dad would take him to a bakery to get a little cookie. Yeah, that sounds about right. It sounds like a European day, because it was. But it was also a quintessential part about being Shanghainese. Like, imagine if I was dressed head to toe in a suit and tie, very demure and dapper. And I told you about this woman that I met at the printing press, and then we went for a movie at the Cathay Theater, and then afterwards we went dancing at the so-and-so-and-so at the Paramount. This sounds like a European or American Golden Age movie, but it was everyday life in Shanghai. And while to most people that sounds un-Chinese, I would hazard to say that for the most Chinese people still alive, i.e. my grandpa's generation, that's the most Chinese activity you could have done. It's all well and good to say that colonialism is bad, but there are things that were good about it. The street, the culture, the part of your identity. No matter how you feel about it, for better or for worse, it is part of what makes you you. Anyways, before I start crying and bitching, roll it out thin after all that superimposing and start folding. So mark out a line in the middle, and then you want to fold a third down like this. Flat folds, flat folds. Don't be too stressed out about getting it perfect, because this is another part about making these that people rarely ever talk about. If you want to make really clean-cut, geometric, precise, perfect French palmiers, then spend this time to clean it up, cut it up, and then do a lot of, I would say, unnecessary freezing in between. But these were also made later in Chinese bakeries. So the versions that I would have grown up with, the Shanghainese versions are actually kind of fluffy and curly because they needed to be baked fast and very industriously. So essentially just roll them up both sides, and then what you want to do is take your rolling pin and crease it in the middle so it thins it out and gives it space to fold up like this. And now you've ended up with a log of palmier dough. If you were taught how to make these classically, the shape wouldn't look like two curls. It would look like two legs. You make two flat folds and then fold them out and then open them up so it looks like a triangle. And it'd be a very long cookie. But you and I both know that the Shanghainese version is curly. And they're usually baked at a lower temperature for longer, so it's more like a crisp. A traditional palmier is very caramelly and kind of almost sticky on the inside sometimes. I like a halfway in between. All right, cool. So you want to cut centimeter slices, but it's entirely up to you. I like a bit of texture, so I'm gonna cut them quite thick. It's making desserts like this that make me unreasonably happy, because I'd like to imagine that if I had a restaurant when my grandpa was a teenager, that I would have been able to sell him these on his way home from work. And there's something really sweet about that. All right, so after you have this, if you want a very even, flat bake, I recommend at this stage, send it into the freezer and freeze them till they're solid, and then bake them between two baking sheets. But I want a slightly curvy experience, so I'm gonna leave it open bake, yeah? This is also a great point for you to freeze so that you can stop here and have pre-made frozen little cookies that you can bake fresh whenever you need them. All right, so if you want the cookies to look this color-ish, that's about 150. If you want it to be like this-ish, that's about 160. If you want it to be, this color is about 170, 180. I like Lorenzo flavored cookies, so I'm gonna go for 170. And this is one of those recipes that I do recommend you preheat your oven for. Fan speed low and a 20-minute bake on 0 humidity, at which point we can make the decision whether or not to turn them over one by one and bake another 10 minutes. Yeah, cool, see you in a sec. So, if this is the color you like, you can stop here. But it would be a missed opportunity for me not to tell you that you can, at this point, flip these over and bake them for another 10 minutes to get another bit of crispy goldenness on the other side. This is traditionally what you would do for palmiers. But, you know, it's entirely up to you. So, because I have non-stick baking sheets, I prefer to do it the quick way. And pray to whatever god it is you pray to that this works out. Now, once you see this side, people who like palmiers will understand that this is actually the favorite side. But if you want this to be the effect for both sides, feel free to, at this point, put the baking sheet on top and send her back into the oven. Baking with a little bit of weight on top does really help at even goldenness. If you don't want to bake with a weight on top, feel free to just flip these around by hand. I'm going to do 2 sheets very differently, so you can get a good look at the effect and see if it's worth your time to bake between 2 sheets or just flip over by hand. These are super hot, but I'm a manly man. Which manly man likes to use protection? All right, so throw it into the oven, exact same temperature, maybe a little bit lower if the coloring is going too fast, and bake for about 5-6 minutes until you get a very even brown, crispy all the way through. Perfect. Amazing. Essentially, this is the trick. Just hire a crew that's a perfect gradient of beige, and then you have references for everything you need to cook. Here I have the tray baked without another tray, and the tray baked with another tray with a roof over its head. And as you can tell, it made literally no difference. I recommend you cool these down on a wire rack so that the bottom has some airflow and then the entire cookie can go unreasonably crisp as it cools down.
进炉的时候要打一些。
对，会发出来的。As the layers of butter inside the dough become hot, the water inside the butter will expand, turn into steam, and then push the layers out. That's what gives it its puff. If it had yeast in it, it would puff harder because it adds carbon dioxide. But without carbon dioxide, you just have the water of the dough and the butter expanding the pastry. And as is traditional, I must sacrifice the ugly one for the cook, which is me today. That is one of the happiest noises that a human being can endure. You just It's nice, right? What can go wrong with butter and sugar and heat and caramel, right? Thank you for joining me on another episode of using my grandpa as an excuse to consume too many calories. And thank you for joining me for a little brief walk down the history of the streets of Shanghai while we make these little pastries. Thanks for watching. Comment, please, for algorithm purposes. Feel free to start an argument down low, or please teach me something that I got wrong. Because there's nothing wrong with learning more about your hometown, right? Anyways, thanks for watching, guys. Take care. I'll see you next week. Comment, like, subscribe.